This week, we're going to take a look at two arcs of an anime that everyone loves to hate, Sword Art Online. This particular topic is one that's amongst my biggest unpopular opinions, so after all these years, I've decided to take my sweet time writing this up so I can point out why I think that Fairy Dance is better than the Aincrad arc. Keep in mind that I won't be talking about the other version of the Aincrad arc, Progressive, since it's a rewrite that fixes a lot of what was wrong with it. There will also be spoilers since I will be talking in depth about certain parts of the arcs. Let's begin by talking about the first arc of SAO, Aincrad. This arc is the one that most people talk about when mentioning the series, and it's generally held in a pretty positive light from what I've personally seen. In my eyes though, I see it as the worst arc in the entire series. It starts off with a really strong introduction, giving you a good feel for the arc, while also establishing the villain and a reason to continue with it right off the bat. The first couple of episodes establish the world a bit and introduce you to some characters you'll be seeing for a couple appearances and throughout the rest of the series in general. For a while though, these episodes are honestly really good, but it starts going downhill once Asuna becomes a main character halfway through the arc. Overall, the story for this arc is really poorly done. It has an aim to escape from the game that they're stuck in, but it takes around 9 episodes before they even start to affect the actual story, leaving about 5 to rush through a story that should have taken much longer to complete. During this time, after being shoehorned into a romance plot that shouldn't even exist given the characters' chemistry, we're introduced to a little AI girl named Yui, which hailed the start of the episodes that I dread within this series, because she's used to try to justify and solidify the forced relationship between Kirito and Asuna. Her time in this arc is relatively short, but the fact that she drags the pacing of the arc from being fast to a slow crawl, only to return to its original pacing an episode and a half later, makes it feel like the time spent here was more important than anything else within Aincrad, even more important than the scenes with Sachi. It also brings about a really questionable scene revolving around Kirito and a GM console, making you wonder about the information that was and wasn't given to the viewer that should have been. Because of how this arc was handled, Aincrad is filled with what feels like side stories rather than main story. They could potentially work when it comes to trying to build the world of the game all the while attempting to give a bit more depth to Kirito, but it just ends up making the series fall flat in both regards, since the story ends up lacking, especially with how much detail gets casually passed. This pacing, combined with the awful writing in the latter half, is what makes the Aincrad arc terrible. The worst offender of the arc is just how most of it only tells you that progress was being made, rather than showing you at least a scene here or there of some sort of progression. It ends up making you miss moments that would be important, making the overall story writing better, but decides that the smaller plots that try to build up Kirito's character are more important, which just clearly isn't the case since they don't even ultimately affect his personality, and that's what makes it end up feeling cheap. The ending of the arc is one of the most unsatisfying parts of the entire experience. The ending revolves around Akihiko Kayaba, the creator of SAO, and with the information the series actually gives you within the arc, it's a complete ass pull. Kirito suspects that Kayaba is Heathcliff because of relatively baseless reasons, such as him leaving Asuna in charge from time to time, and his duel with him in an earlier episode. Despite these things being able to be easily excused, what makes this feel so horrible is because, once again, the lack of information being shown. Kirito ultimately suspects Heathcliff of being Kayaba because his health is in the green after a boss fight, but it completely glosses over the situation. It feels like such a forced scene because Kirito just shows no common sense, skipping over the fact that Heathcliff could have easily just used healing potions towards the end of the fight to keep his health that high. The final fight of the arc afterwards ends just as fast as it started, and with how the end of the arc even starts, it makes it feel like getting into it in the first place was a mistake because of how anticlimactic everything is, and spoiling what good things the arc had previously established. Not only was it anticlimactic, it was also one of the most annoying Deus Ex Machinas I've seen in the series. It's explained in the light novel that Kayaba turns off permadeath for the fight, at least in how I understood what it said, but it still doesn't explain how a dead player can kill a living one. It just puts such a sour taste in your mouth. A Deus Ex Machina for Aincrad honestly could have been good, but the writing leading up to that completely forgets the rules that were set up in the first place. The Aincrad arc is all over the place in its writing. It had an amazing setting that could have done really well, but it decided not to capitalize on it, and it even takes the permadeath and makes it somewhat of a joke comparatively, to focus on a forced romance story that has no business being there. Aincrad had a lot of good ideas, but I can't, with good conscience, talk about many of those good things because they're hindered by the poor execution or just omission of information that the viewer should know. And if it had more time and revision, it would have been a lot better than what state it left off in. You can clearly see what some of the scenes were going for, but all of what it lacks completely undermine what could have been great had it been handled a different way. For example, with the Deus Ex Machina, you can clearly tell what is trying to be conveyed, and the scene that comes after it is honestly really well done and beautiful. But what took place moments earlier really hurts how you'd originally perceive it, because of how poorly it was managed. Next, we'll move on to the other arc that I wanted to talk about, Fairy Dance, also known as the first arc to take place within Alfheim Online. This is the arc that I feel improved Sword Art Online's writing by a noticeable margin. From the first moment of the arc, the story is being directly contributed towards, and doesn't feel like anything is straying from the path, and it even gives us an infinitely better written female lead for this arc than Asuna could ever give us. Fairy Dance has a pretty nice start to it, giving us a reason to get back into the full dive MMO by immediately showing us the villain of the arc. This particular villain is what I feel is the single most bad part of the entire arc, because of how much of a downgrade he was compared to Kayaba. He's much better in writing than Kayaba, but he's written to be way too vile of a human being to give some sort of urgency for fans to worry about. And that detracts a lot from the overall value because he just becomes a creep that drags Asuna into another game to give her Stockholm Syndrome. This particular part is the basis behind why Fairy Dance even happens, and it's the worst offender of it. But what happens within the arc is a pretty big step up in the writing from the previous one, specifically with the characters you see all the time. Besides that, you may notice right away that the arc improves on some of the more noticeable problems that Aincrad had. The pacing feels a lot better. Yui was downgraded to a glorified GPS for most of the arc. The viewer is given more useful information than what Aincrad had done, and the game that they're in is relatively a lot better made, especially with its introduction of its pseudo-class system with the races to make it a lot more interesting of a world this time around. From the start of the arc, you notice that it keeps the same general speed to it, and since we get to see direct contribution towards the story, it makes you able to see that it has a lot better of a direction to it, as opposed to the previous one being very inconsistent. While the goal is also straightforward like in Aincrad, the difference here is that you actually get to see that get worked towards throughout the entire arc. This arc has a lack of side characters compared to the first arc, but that improved the writing since it didn't feel the need to impede on the focus of the more important parts of the plot in order to introduce a secondary or tertiary character that you'll likely see for 5 to 10 minutes at the very most. There's a noticeably larger amount of fan service within it as well, but the scenes that contain those are relatively short, although it's still a bit weird since practically all of them are reduced to Suguha moments, which is where I feel like a lot of the criticism towards her is focused. During Fairy Dance, you notice that the writing keeps a semblance of consistency within itself. The fights are even more interesting to watch in this one this time around because the game world is described as skill-based rather than level-based, which, although it can be used as an excuse to reinforce Kirito's plot armor, it at least keeps true to the game's rule and tries to explain how it could happen, which is a courtesy that Aincrad didn't give to its writing for much of its time. The subplot in this arc is handled much better, being a lot more thought out than the one that's in Aincrad, and it's shown by how it leads itself towards the end goal of Fairy Dance. It's a small deviation from the plot, but it's not so jarring of one that it takes more focus from the main one. Since the skill-based rather than level-based system came up earlier in the arc, it sets up a pretty good fight to solidify the system, albeit not needed since it was overkill with showing that Kirito could be a guy that's supposedly one of the strongest people in the game, despite realistically only playing for 2 days, reminding you that Kirito is written to have no flaws. Fairy Dance revolves around the themes of mind control, and I find that this is the most interesting part of the arc. While the entire reasoning behind it with the main villain and Asuna is garbage in terms of its writing, the mind control that the villain wants to do for this arc is a lot more well done than the gimmick for Aincrad, especially since the rules within this were respected a lot more than in the previous arc, giving the viewer a better reason to watch. This particular kind of plotline has been done the world over, but it was handled really well, especially compared to the terrible way Aincrad ended. The only thing else that I can really say is that the downside to it is that it wasn't utilized to its fullest potential, because it's just mentioned but we never get to see it in action by the end of the arc. People I've talked to about this arc in greater detail tend to say that this is the worst one because of the underlying themes that it entails, and that said scenes make the arc itself irredeemable, but that's where I feel it's very wrong. These particular things don't have the best writing, but I feel it's done very well from a writing perspective, simply because it gives you a strong reason to watch the villain be taken down. It's written oddly and executed poorly in some places, but I believe that the arc itself is wholly redeemable because of the other contents within it, and focusing on that particular point isn't right since the good things in the other aspects of the arc outweigh what bad things that are contained. The ending of this arc is a lot better paced and backed up with a lot more support from the fact that everything happening within the arc contributed towards the story. It makes it feel a lot better than what you got with the previous arc. The only time it really shows a bit of deviation from the path that felt like it went a bit too far from it was when they go into Kirito's backstory with his family during this. It's a nice little touch, but it does feel quite a bit out of place and clashes with the tone of the arc up until this point, which can take someone that was heavily invested in this out of it. It's not badly written in the slightest, but the fact that it just came out of nowhere catches you off guard. The only thing that ruins this sort of moment, though, is just how stiffly written of a character Kirito is, making the feelings that he's supposed to be experiencing feel really forced. The deviation quickly resolves itself to get us back to the main story, and this is where the arc makes up for Aincrad's really awful ending. The only part that I feel is particularly bad when it comes to this is just how Yui can inexplicably use her powers to open a door that is not meant to be opened, using a keycard that they said could only work on a particular GM console, leaving an easily noticed plot hole. These scenes that involve Yui are ultimately distracting, because it's one of the only instances within the arc where the already laid rules were broken, considering Yui was said to have had her administrative powers removed, but she still somehow opens doors that should only be able to be opened by certain things, which, once again, cannot be opened by the GM console card. When the climax comes around, it's where the least enjoyable parts of the arc are shown. The villain getting all this time within the arc shows his creepiness in full bloom, which is fairly tasteless because of the stuff mentioned previously. This arc, once again, ends with a Deus Ex Machina, but it's handled in a much better way, which the previous writing within the series supports a lot better than in Aincrad. It's still a bit annoying, but it shows that the writing of the series has gotten better. The last scene within Alfheim might have been a bit disappointing, but the arc ends on a high note with seeing the villain finally getting what he's deserved for the entire length of the arc, that being a man, presumably in his late 20s, early 30s, losing a fight to a 16-year-old boy that he felt he was so threatened by. To that degree, it's such a hilariously fitting way to end the arc, and leads on to some pleasant scenes after that, albeit a bit underwhelming. Now, we'll talk about how our main characters are within their respective arcs to show how they ultimately affected the series. In Aincrad, they start off really great, but they start to get significantly worse as time goes on. Only really in terms of their development, though. They get pretty stale, but when Fairy Dance comes along, they start to show noticeable improvements. Kirito had a start with some great potential for development, but just ends up going into this niche of part blank slate with the worst parts of Sasuke from Naruto. Throughout Aincrad, we're told that he's supposed to be feeling guilty about what happened to Sachi and his old guild to develop him, but all it ever does is show that he hasn't developed at all since the early episodes, because he never actually wants to get involved with anything, despite him saying otherwise. The only times he ever goes out of his way to do anything that's not for him alone is when Asuna gets dragged into it, because her character is a damsel in distress. In Fairy Dance, Kirito is a much better character, but his entire being changes into more focused as a person that you can project into, and that's pretty apparent from how the arc doesn't try to include moments that are there to try to develop him. Personality-wise, there were some major improvements from being incredibly mopey to having more confidence in what he does, but the moments where he gets angry are still very mishandled, as it's taken as a way to excuse things and mark that he's going to win no matter what kind of crap gets pulled. While this isn't a bad part of a character to have, it ruins some of the enjoyment that you could have because you'll always know how a fight ends if this happens. Asuna is a very disappointing character and a huge waste of potential. She has some really good qualities to her, but the worst thing is that she's verbally shown as this strong character, supposedly stronger than or around the same strength as Kirito, but she always finds herself in situations where she always has to be rescued. A complete 180 from her personality, giving the viewer a sense of riding whiplash. I find her character as a whole very distasteful, because you're not supposed to make a love interest with such great potential get written into a corner to where they only talk about how strong they are in one moment, but then goes back on their talk the next. How Asuna dips from strong female lead to defenseless damsel affects the quality and enjoyment that the series could have had, and it's no wonder why the arcs where she doesn't show up much end up being much better in writing. She doesn't do a whole lot, so she doesn't take the spotlight over Kirito. And after the first arc, she just gets moved back to being a side character again. Her entire existence in the original version of Sword Art Online is just to be there so Kirito has a reason to get involved with anything, a simple plot device to force progression, and becomes so one-note that she seems to always be replaced by a better written female lead for a different arc. She is only better in Fairy Dance because of her lack of being there, and I feel that her scenes that weren't with the villain of the arc were honestly really good. They didn't stay around for too long, but they also weren't too short, so it gave it away to show some improvements to her character. Lastly, we'll talk about Suguha. While she's not without her Brokan quirks, Sugu is a character that made the series very enjoyable for me. She takes the role that Asuna held for the length of Fairy Dance, and does everything better in every aspect of it, with exception to the obvious love interest part because of Kirito's badly written obsession for Asuna. Her biggest flaw is probably the most obvious one of her being inexplicably in love with Kirito, but I feel it's really tastefully done compared to other series where the character is in love with their cousin or sibling. Sugu gets a lot of criticism because of her feelings, but they're developed really well, and it's based around the fact that something similar can actually happen in real life. It's a really complex kind of feeling, and the way she grew up around Kirito with how he acted towards her explains it really well. The writing for her towards the end of the arc, however, gets lighter since it's trying to gear the way for Asuna to rejoin the series, and I feel that it could have been handled a lot better than what it was. Sword Art Online is far from a perfect series, but I feel Fairy Dance is much better of an arc than Aincrad is by a long shot. It might not have that great of an impact to others as it does for me, but it's an amazing arc, and it led me into much better animes when I started my anime binge way back when. So, with all that out of the way, I really need to ask you how you feel about these particular arcs. I've only ever met one person that agreed with my opinion on Fairy Dance in the past 7 years since the anime came out, and I would very much appreciate to know how you personally feel about things too. Whether you agree or disagree, I want to know, because those opinions are the most enjoyable parts about the anime community for me.